guys, in this episode we're going to talk about sprites in PixiJS and all the different things we can do with them and play around with them a bit. So let's dive in. So we're going to start again with our project from episode 2 using Pixi application. I'm going to first create 3 new sprite variables for us to play with and then load in a new texture. Then we're going to create our first sprite by calling new Pixi sprite and passing in the texture. And then we're going to add it to the stage, calling app.stage add child, and then passing in the sprite. So if we test this, you should see our 2 sprites, the one in the upper corner and the other one spinning. So let's go ahead and remove our rotation that's happening in our animation loop, and then let's go and add 2 other sprites by copying the code where we were adding our initial sprite, updating the names of the variables. Then I'm just going to go through and update the Y position of all of the sprites to 100 so they're not overlapping the top of the screen. And then let's update the X position of the second and third sprite, offsetting those a bit so they're not overlapping each other. And it should look something like this. So we've got our 3 sprites in the upper left-hand corner, and then our background image in the middle of the screen. So aside from sprites, we also have containers in PixiJS, and these are sort of your root display object that you can add other display objects into for grouping purposes. And you can do pretty much the same thing with a container as you can with sprites aside from images and textures. So let's go ahead and add a container here, and you add it the same way you would add a sprite, just using Pixi container. And then let's add all our sprites to our container instead of the stage. And note that we're adding the container to the stage itself when we initialize it. So now let's update some of the properties of our sprite in our animation loops. Let's create a delta variable and set it to 0. And then inside of our animation loop, we'll increment it by 0.1 every loop. Then what we can do is we can take our sprite's Y variable and set it to the sign of our delta multiplied by 10. And this should make it oscillate up and down. We need to add 100 to it because we don't want it oscillating from the 0 position. We want it oscillating from that 100 Y position that we initially set it to. And so here you see the result of it oscillating up and down on the Y axis. We can of course do the same thing on the X axis to one of our other sprites. So if we duplicate this code, access one of the other sprite variables, and then set the X property, you can see here it's oscillating on the X axis. We can of course do the same thing to our container. So if we set the container's X property to, again, math.sign of the delta times 10, we'll get that same oscillation on the Y-axis, only everything in the container is moving. Another property we can change on our sprite is the scale property. So the scale property takes a point. So we can add a new Pixi point and set it to 0.5 and 0.5. And this will scale it by half, so that it takes an X and Y property. So you'll see it's half its size. We can also go in and update the anchor position of our sprite. So if we go back to that same sprite and set its anchor position to 0.5, the anchor is now at the center of our sprite. So the X and Y position as well as the scale is happening outward from the center of our sprite. So if you'll notice, we're setting the anchor a little differently than we're setting the X and Y. And you can actually set the X and Y the same way by calling position set on the sprite and then passing in the X and then Y properties. So because we set the anchor to the center on this sprite, it will also rotate around that center point. So if we increase the rotation on each animation loop by 0.1, you'll see it's now rotating around the center position of the sprite. So let's say we want to rotate it around a different point other than the center or anchor. Well, we can actually set the pivot point, and this can allow it to rotate around a separate point. So we set the X and Y value here, and you can see it's rotating around a point that we've defined rather than the center or anchor of the sprite. And we can set this value to any number we want, so we can rotate around any arbitrary point within the scene. So just for fun, let's go back in and set our sprite scale to 2, making it twice the size it would originally be. So another property we can change in our sprite is the alpha. So we can set this to the sign of our delta, and it will oscillate between 1 and -1. Since opacity can't go below 0, it just fades in and out. Another property sprites have is tint, and this allows you to tint your sprite a specific color. So it takes a hexadecimal value, and we're setting it here to red. So now I'm going to put our first sprite in the center of the screen so we can focus on it better. And I'm going to set its position to half the renderer's width and height. And then I'm going to set its anchor point to 0.5 so that the anchor is in the center of our sprite. Then I need to make sure that I remove where we're animating the Y position in our animation loop. Now you can see it's in the center of our screen. So another property that we can adjust on our sprite is the blend modes. So PixiJS in its WebGL renderer supports a few blend modes, and one of those is multiply. So we can set the blend mode to pixi.blendmodes.multiply. And you'll see our sprite now has the multiply blend mode applied, in that all the white values become transparent. We can also set the sprite's visible property to false, and this is a good way to quickly hide or reveal sprites within your scene. Sprites also have an interactive property which allows functionality like hit testing for the cursor. So if we set interactive to true and then set button mode to true, when our cursor goes over the sprite, we'll get a pointer like we normally would with a button, for example. Sprites also have a mask property which can be assigned to another display object, like another sprite. So here we're assigning the mask of our first sprite to be the second sprite, and this will impact the transparent portions of our first sprite. Now, in order for this to work, we have to have it overlap the first sprite. This means that we need to change the position of that second sprite so that it overlaps. And then we're going to animate it on the x-axis so that it's at the center position of the screen, but then we want it to oscillate. So we're going to do the sign of our delta, and it'll oscillate between positive and -10 pixels. So here you can see our sprite overlapping and affecting the transparency of the underlying sprite. And just so you can see what's happening, I'll comment out that line, and you'll see we just have our masked sprite oscillating back and forth above the original sprite that's being masked. So now let's have some fun with sprites. Let's remove all the instances of the sprites that we created manually, and let's remove all the changes that we made to them inside our animation loop. So here's what we want to do. We want to create a for loop that adds a bunch of sprites to our scene. So let's keep track of these in an array called sprites, and then create our for loop. This loop will iterate 10 times. So now we need to create our actual sprite. So let's create a pixi sprite, passing in the texture that we want. And then we simply add it to our container with container add child, and then passing in the sprite. Then we can add our sprite to our array just to keep track of it for future use. Then we need to set the position of our sprite, and we're just going to position these randomly across our scene. So we'll do math.random times app.renderer screen.width. And then we'll do the same thing to the y-axis, adjusting it for the screen's height. Then we want to make sure that anchor is at the center, so we'll set it to 0.5. So if we preview this, you'll see our sprites are now randomly scattered across the screen. So now we can adjust other properties, like we'll change the tint to be a random value. So if we do math.random, then multiply that by the hexadecimal value for white, we'll see now we get random tints across all of our sprites. So now, of course, we can animate these sprites by animating the container in our animation loop and animating its y property to the sine of our delta multiplied by 10. So now they animate up and down in an oscillating fashion. So just to clean this up a little bit, I'm going to take where we're adding all our sprites and move that into a method called add sprites. And I'm just taking that whole for loop that we created that adds all of our sprites to the scene. Because we're storing our sprites in an array, we can now access them individually by iterating over that array. So we can iterate over our sprites array in a for loop, and then access each individual sprite updating a property of it. So here we're updating the rotation property by 0.1 on each animation loop. And we need to make sure that we're accessing each item in the array. So if we test this, you'll see they're now all spinning on their own axis. So that's it for my episode on sprites. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.